Okay guys, so in this video we are going to talk about React and job interview questions that I think are fairly relevant to ask of a candidate when you're interviewing them for a React position. So let's get into it. Now I'm going to make this a two-parter where the first section, which is the thing that you're watching right now, is going to be about just walking through the questions, and the questions are the important thing, guys. The questions and the personal interview is where I focus most of my attention in the past. Like these job interview questions I've just kind of made up based on my experiences working with React and what I think is very relevant for a professional working with React on a daily basis. And apart from that, I've conducted a few interviews myself, so I kind of know from a little bit of experience. I'm not a master or anything like that. It's usually the personal interview is usually the quickest way to figure out if somebody's good. But there's also going to be a code test because yeah, code tests are an industry standard, and it's fairly important to have them to just get some understanding of whether or not the candidate actually knows how to write software. So let's get the formalities out first. So this is a subscriber request video, and basically one of my subscribers reached out and asked, "Hey, Frederick, could you talk a little bit about React interview stuff and things of that nature, how things that you consider in a job interview, or if you were hiring somebody who's supposed to be doing React right." I made a previous series where I just did vanilla JavaScript, so hey, this makes sense, right? So the goal, as I stated earlier, is that like to get a good interview. Like I'm not the goal is not to try to figure out how good somebody is at what they do. It's almost impossible to figure out like unless you really know your stuff. And I mean even then it's tricky to figure out if somebody's really good at something or not. Like I have my own tips and tricks that I use for that, but I don't. This is not the video for that because it's very subjective and it's not something that. Well, I can share it in another video, but it's not in this. I'm not going to share it in this video. But in general, what you're going for is to figure out whether or not the candidate is going to be able to be productive fairly quickly, or at least have the potential to become productive. So these questions that you see down here are basically the questions. I'll just very briefly scroll through all of the stuff that I'm going to show you, and so that if you just want to skip this whole thing and just skip the video, you can do that. And for the rest of you who want to stay, I will walk through each section one line by line and give you some thoughts on it. So as I said, these are just questions that I know for a fact are relevant to a person who is doing daily work in React land. So let's get into it. So the first question, why does React need a root element? A bad answer is that you don't know. If a junior comes to me and says that they don't know why there's need for a root element, then I can't hire you because then you know nothing about React, like literally nothing. And maybe, well, I can't. It's strong to say that I can't hire you. It's more about if the company is okay with that. Like, imagine, like, I'm not your boss. I'm just some guy who's going to try to determine if you are worthy investment for the company or not. And if my boss tells me that, hey, we're okay with just getting anyone, then this, just answering that you don't know, then it doesn't really matter. I don't think that that's ever going to happen. So you should really know why React needs a root element. So a decent answer is that React needs a root element to hook into, and the good answer is basically since React is all JavaScript, it needs an element where it can render out its own DOM tree. What that basically means is that I want to figure out if the candidate understands how React actually works, because some people don't really do that. So there's a difference between HTML and JavaScript, and that should be obvious too. It should be something a junior knows about. So React is an all JavaScript framework. In other words, there is no HTML at all in React. What you use in order to make something that, like, you have seen people most likely use what looks like HTML inside of React components. That is called JSX. That is not HTML. It's just a It's just a DSL, a domain-specific language that is on top of JavaScript. If you wanted to, you could actually just not write that and simply use JavaScript objects and functions to do the exact same thing. And that's why you use Babel and all these fancy loaders to transpile all of that JSX into something that JavaScript can actually execute in the browser. So that distinction, you need to know about that, because what's on the HTML page is not what is in React. So React needs a root element to hook into to start the rendering. That's where the component is going to be created. That's why you need to know about the root element. So what is the difference between state and props? If you don't know that, that's also a big red flag for me, because it's one of the most fundamental things about React. So a decent answer is that the state is where you store stuff that is internal. That's a pretty good explanation. Props is where you store stuff that is going to be going to the next component. Also a decent answer. Good answer. State is a way for a component to store an internal state, and it is perfect for when you need to store a field value or perhaps toggle a modal. Now, if a candidate says this to me, that means that they are elaborating on what the decent answer is and kind of explaining that they understand when you should use state and when you should use a prop. Because there are components where a state makes a lot of sense. Say a checkbox, toggling a checkbox on and off. You don't need props for that. You don't need something like Redux or a global state to hold that information. It's perfectly fine to just keep that as an internal thing, unless you have there is another reason as to why you would like to have that as a prop, but that's outside of this discussion. And modals are also a classic example where you want to show a modal and then you have a state which indicates that, hey, it's being shown, and then you can flip the state to that it's not being shown anymore. Perfect example of when a state is a nice thing. So props is what is being passed to the component from the parent element. This is how you most commonly work with data in React. This is absolutely true. If the ratio should be 5%, 10% state, and 90% props. Props is like the convention is to use props in React, and a candidate that understands this that's really good. What is context? Now we're getting a little bit fancy. So bad answer, I don't know. I wouldn't kill a candidate for not knowing what context is, but it's nice if they know about it. So context is like a global prop. That's a decent answer because it's fairly accurate. Context is a globally available prop that should only be used on occasions when you need something that is going to be everywhere in the application, perhaps for translating text or something like that. If you say that to me, that means that you understand that there are certain situations where you literally need something to be globally available to every single component in React. Now, you don't have to use a context to do this, but it's a very good answer. Because even Facebook themselves are kind of like, they had context that they weren't really sure about it, and now in React 16 and so forth, we're seeing a different interface where they are actually going to start supporting a context-like interface. So the rule here is that this is, with great power comes great responsibility. Context should be like you should really only use it for a very specific reason. But if you know about it and you know the use case, that's very impressive to me. That indicates that you know what you're talking about. What are prop types and what are the benefits and the drawbacks of them? So bad answer, I don't know. If you don't know about prop types, then my guess is that you haven't been working with React for very long, because they are a very fundamental part of working in a professional capacity with React. Now, a decent answer is that prop types is a way for you to know what types a component is expecting. That's a decent answer because that's in essence what it is. It's just a way for React to give you a way to express what the component is expecting. It's basically a type system, something like what you would find in Flow or TypeScript or in a typed language like Java. That's virtually the idea of it. They are great for when you want to know what a component needs to work. I don't know when they are a problem, to be honest. And this is okay, because if you are a junior and you haven't really worked that long with React, you may not figure out why these things are a problem. So as you can see here in the good answer, it's basically the same answer with one difference, and that is the explanation as to why they can be a problem. They often become legacy documentation and people forget to keep them updated, or they put .required on the wrong things, and often I see people use .object instead of .shapeof. This is an excellent answer. If somebody tells me this in a job interview, I know for a fact that they've been working for more than a little while. Because one of the most common issues that you will find is that people neglect, like they add these things in, and I mean, I have coworkers who do this all day every day. It feels like they do it all day every day, where you say that you want a string, but what you're actually passing in is a number, and then React in development mode just keep on telling you that, hey, there's a warning, you're giving me the wrong thing, and people just kind of like zone out and pretend like it's raining. They don't care about it. And then I ask, why do you have the prop type in to begin with? If you're just gonna ignore it, why are you so like? And it's such a paradox, because everybody wants them, but they don't want to maintain them. And the same thing goes for object. So object is just a generic way for you to say that, hey, there's an object, but shape of, like if you already know that there's going to be a shape to that object and that object is going to contain some data, why are you using object and not shape of? I personally I'm not a big fan of prop types, but if you are using them, you should use them correctly. Which lifecycle event is the most common from your perspective? Bad answer, I don't know, I never use them. If you are not using lifecycle events or something like that in React, then you have made no, then you haven't been, as once again, then I don't think that you've been working for all that long. Lifecycle events are very, very common in anything that is non-trivial. So a decent answer is component will mount or component did mount. Very good answers. These are probably the most common ones that you will face. In React 16 this is a little bit different, but up until this point they are very, very common. Good answer. Component will mount, component did mount, and component will receive props. It is often that I find that I need to do something when my component is getting a new state. This is an excellent answer. If you tell me that you have this, that you are using this, and you give me a good explanation of a scenario where this was useful, that's very impressive to me, because a lot of, like, I've been in many situations where people have come to me and talk to me and ask me, like, Frederick, I just need to react to when the component changes. I don't want it to re-render all the time. I just want to change something if it's getting new information that is in a certain shape. That's exactly what component will receive props is used for, or historically. React 16 is a little bit different, but that's the way to use it, basically, to react, if you will, no pun intended, when something changes. That's basically it. When do you use a pure component? When do you use a class? Bad answer, I don't know. I only use pure components, or I only use classes. If you give me this stuff here, then you don't have an understanding of when one makes sense and one doesn't make sense. It's okay. I won't kill you over this, but it's something that I mean it. You see, this is the sort of thing that it's not a game deal breaker if you say this. It's just that it would be nice if you had an understanding of it. That's it. So decent answer is I use pure components when I want to optimize for performance. That's a very good answer. Like, for the most part, using a pure component is it's the way to go. If you can use it, you should use it. It's more lightweight, and there's really no need to instantiate an object. So it's a very good and decent answer. I favor using pure components because there is often no reason to use a class if I am not storing a state or using a lifecycle event. This is a great answer. This is a really good a really good answer, because there's often this scenario where I see a lot of people instantiate a React class without actually using, they are not using the state, and they are not using any of the lifecycle events. They are simply adding a few functions to something that could have been a rendered component, and they don't understand that, yeah, sure, you can create a class, But why would you create a class to just hold a bunch of functions that are a bunch of other functions? Like, that's not really something that is necessary. If you're using React, you're most likely using a bundler such as Webpack, for example, which means that you can simply declare a bunch of functions in the file without having to have a class, and you can simply use the scope to execute your logic. Why are you using the object? And that's like it's not a game, like, it's not a deal breaker. It's just that it's a mindset that you see in object oriented programming a lot. Oh yeah, I'm creating an object and then I create all of my internal methods and they are going to operate on something. Yeah, it's not wrong. It's just that in React and in JavaScript you don't have to think that way. And if you are not using, as I said, the lifecycle event or the state, there's really no reason for you. It's uncommon that there's a good reason for you to use the class. It's just something that I've found over the years. Explain how the React rendering works in your own terms. Bad answer, I don't know. This is a high level question. Like, if you don't know, that's okay. I would like you to have a basic understanding of how it works because it becomes very important. There's often a bug that is related to that you expect a re-render to occur, but it doesn't, and you can't figure out why the interface isn't changing when you're expecting it to, or maybe you are seeing a re-render when you're not expecting a component to be re-rendered, and then there's a bug. This is very common. Like, most of my coworkers come to me for these sorts of questions, and it usually boils down to not understanding how the rendering works. Now, I'm not a master of the rendering engine, but I know the basics. So, decent answer. React listens for DOM updates and re-renders the DOM tree on every change, and that's something that it's absolutely true. That's a very good explanation. Good answer. React listens for DOM updates and renders the DOM tree on every change, but it can do this very quickly because it uses component diffing, which means that React checks if there has been a change to the component and only re-renders if there is one. Now, this is just a very fancy way of saying that React this is why it can do it so fast, because if you think about it, if React has to re-render the whole DOM every single time somebody types into an input field or something like that, that's going to be very heavy. But React uses what we call React uses a diffing algorithm where it can actually determine whether or not a state has updated in a component. And by doing so, it only re-renders the things that are actually changing in an ideal case. It can get more advanced than that, but we're not going to dive deeply into that. What is Redux? I don't know. If you don't know about Redux, then you most likely haven't been working in a professional capacity. That's not a big deal, but Redux is almost like, it's so closely tied into React that it's almost hilarious. Redux is a popular tool for storing state in React. Very good answer. So, but the best answer would be if you said something along the lines, Redux is a popular tool for storing state in React. It is built on the pub/sub pattern or flux, and the idea is that you store your state in a big object and use actions to change the state, or to change that state. Basically what that means is that if you tell me something of that nature, that means that you know how flux works. And this is not an easy thing, guys. There's a lot of flux, and more specifically Redux is not an easy framework. I'm sorry to say. I wish it was easier, but unfortunately it's almost an industry standard. I would go as far as to say that it's basically an industry standard when it comes to React. So it's very important that you learn it, but unfortunately it's not that easy to understand for a beginner. So if you come to me and you explain this to me, that you understand how Redux works, that's very, very nice, because that's usually the thing that messes up a lot of developers, and not just beginners, very experienced developers as well. Explain how Redux works in your own terms. I don't know is, well, not the worst answer. There's no decent answer. To me it's like, there's a good answer and there's a bad answer. The good answer is you declare a reducer that takes in an action and a state. When you dispatch an action, the state gets updated and React re-renders the DOM with the state change. That's as like this is like the best way that I can define it in a single sentence. That's exactly that. This is how it works. You have basically what it all boils down to is that you have a JavaScript object that holds all your state, and then you have a bunch of functions that gets called when there's an action that gets dispatched that wants to change that state, so that all the reducers that you've declared you basically just pipe that state through all the reducers and make the updates, and on the end of that pipe comes out the new state, and then React uses that to re-render itself. You can go and check that out exactly if you want to get into more detail. When do you use Redux? Bad answer, I don't know. Another bad answer is I use it for everything. It's perfect. If you use Redux for everything, then I don't think that you have then you're going a little bit overboard. Decent answer. Most projects, as it is very common that you need some global state that is shared among different components. Good answers. Basically the same thing. Only in applications that need to share the global state. I mean, it doesn't make sense to use Redux in your app if you don't share the state. Now, this is actually a tricky one. What this means, because this actually happened to me on one of my job interviews, where I was asked to make a React application for an interview, and I built it, and I realized that, hey, this little trivial application is just a list that's fetching some data from an API and then showing that list. That's all it really is. That's what it's doing. That means that there's no reason to use Redux, because there are no components that need to notify each other that the state changes. You don't have to share the state. It's just one big component that needs to get some data from an API. So Redux in that scenario would just be a bunch of overhead that just adds more complexity. And this takes a bit of experience to understand when Redux is a good idea and when it's not a good idea. The rule of thumb is that more complicated applications need Redux. Very simple applications that don't have all of this which, they're not that common, but they still exist, shouldn't use Redux. So for a beginner, I would say this: start without Redux, and when you understand when Redux makes a lot of sense, then you add it to your stack. What is a container component? Bad answer, I don't know. If you don't know what a container component is, I would say that you're very new to React. It's a fairly common term. It's the same thing with Vue component down here. We'll look at that in just a moment. A decent answer is a container component is a popular way to separate the JSX from the logic of the component. Good answer. A container component is a popular way to separate the JSX from the logic of a component, but I only use it when my component is doing more than showing some information or passing things through to the view. Now, if you give me this answer and you elaborate and explain a little bit, this will impress me a lot. Because most people who don't really understand how, in my opinion, how things work in React land, they will use a container for everything. And the container is to just explain to the juniors out there, the container is just a component that is holding all of the logic and functions and all the things that the component needs to be able to do, and the view, which we will touch on later on, is just a thing that you show to the user. So it's basically, if you're familiar with the MVC pattern, this is basically the C in MVC. The view is the V. That's basically how it works. So if you can consider that if you don't have any logic, if your component isn't doing anything except from just getting some props and showing that to the user, then a container makes no sense. Why would you use the container? You could use it, but it's just extra code for no real benefit. That's at least in my experience. What is a view component? I don't know is a bad answer. Decent answer: the view component is the dumb part of the component where you simply put the passed in props to JSX. Good answer. Basically the same thing. The view is now separated from the logic, and some people will argue that this makes it reusable, but that is very rarely true. This is also something that you can kind of throw in there if you, or rather that's something that I've heard a few candidates say, one or two candidates say in the past, where, and this is very, very impressive. If they understand this stuff, they are not beginners. So one of the things that people use Vue and container components as a selling point for is that, okay, the container makes the Vue easier, and some people will make an argument, oh yeah, that makes the Vue reusable. Trust me when I say it is very, very rare that the Vue part of a React component gets reusable. It's very, very rare. Usually there's a one-to-one mapping, at least in my experience. There, of course, I don't know everything, guys. It's just that I've been working for a few years now, and I've never even talked to anybody who reuses their views. Sometimes, on the off chance that it's possible, they will, but for the most part, they don't. So having somebody who kind of understands that, just like everything that Facebook and like the ideas that are promoted are not just, they're not true just because a big company is telling you that that's the way it works. What components make for a good container candidate? Bad answer, I don't know. Decent answer, almost all components except perhaps for components that have no logic. That's a pretty good answer. Good answer. I try to only use a container on components that are a bit more complex because the container itself makes the component more complex. And if I'm only making a small component without any extra complexity, the cost of the container is greater than simply not using the container. This is what I was saying earlier. If you are just showing something to the user, if all you're doing is taking some props, maybe a piece of text or something like that, and you want to add that to a component within some HTML or JSX in this scenario, and then just render that as a component and show that to the user. Why would you need the container? All it's going to do is that the container is going to take in the props, and then it's going to pass it down to the view. It's not doing anything, therefore, because there's no logic, there's no functionality. So the container is just another step. So that's basically the questions. Like, I mean, you could ask a lot more questions, but those are the basic questions that I would find very useful to ask a candidate. And if depending on their answers, you get a fairly good understanding of what their skill level with React is. So, when interviewing someone for a React job, it is vital that you have someone who knows React. Yeah, that does it basically. Because trust me, no recruiter or recruitment company will know half of what is needed to figure out if someone knows React. Trust me when I say this, guy. People who don't work in React will not understand how to figure out if somebody is good with React or not. They will be able to figure out if they are a developer, if they have experience with JavaScript, but not if they're good with React. Recruitment companies have no idea. Trust me. The questions you have seen are questions from someone who has worked with React for several years, and yeah, that would be me. They are questions that every React developer will face on a daily basis, and those are the sort of questions that you want your candidate to have answers to. So what I mean by that is basically that these are not all the questions, but these are some of the most common questions and challenges and things that you will face on a daily basis. So if you have good answers to those, then I know that you're good. You don't have to be a super genius. I just need to know that you understand how it is to work in React. That's it. Anyone can learn React just as anyone could learn jQuery back in the day. The question is if you want someone who is good with React or someone who can do the job and deal with the fallout later. There are benefits to both approaches. And that's what I'm going to end with. I'm going to tell you this. It is tricky to find people who are really good at JavaScript, like really good front-end developers who have an understanding of both how to like work on the server and like how to work in front-end and so forth. And it's also very tricky to find professional people who are good at React. It's something very along the lines of how jQuery used to work in the day. You had like professional backend developers who had no idea how to make a good front-end project work and kind of create, like, just do that job for you. There are benefits and downsides to that as well. If you want a clean code base that is sustainable over time, it's very important that you have at least one person who is really good at React on the project and so who can take ownership of the front-end code. But if it's very tricky for you to find such a person, then maybe it's better to just find someone who is really passionate and really interested and like wants to contribute to do the job instead. They may not produce as good of the same types of results, but they're very likely to at least get the job done. That's at least from my experience. And yeah, that's for it for part one. I'll see you in part two.